Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm mckay, and today we're going to be taking a look at Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This one was first published in 1864 in two parts, I believe in the early period of the year, and in a magazine called Epoch, which was actually put together by Fyodor Dostoevsky's brother Mikhail. And, well, I'll come out and say it. I actually think that this is my favourite novel of Dostoevsky's. Some people call it a novella. I would consider it a novel. There's a lot of contradictory information out there again about word count, what equates a novel, blah, blah, blah. But for me, this is, it's a novel, just about. It's told in two parts, the underground part being a kind of diatribe from our unnamed, unreliable narrator, where he criticises the social utopianism ideology of the time, or what is being proposed quite often either by literature or by thinkers of its time. And that is this ideology that supports a system where men should be pursuing happiness, and if the society works correctly, that happiness should easily be achieved as long as man does it out of his own accord. In essence, through his own selfishness in some regards, but also that if everyone were to comply with this line of thinking, then happiness would be achieved. Dostoevsky wasn't having that, and here is his reaction to it. It was originally supposed to be a kind of almost a literary review, in a sense, of a novelist at the time, by a book called What Is to Be Done. And I believe that was a fictional piece. I haven't actually read it. I'll get it up if I can again. But what the Dost found was that he couldn't express what he wanted to express. And so eventually this was born out of it instead. And I mean, I adore it personally. It's an anti-book told by an anti-hero with a style that was so transgressive for its time, but also just a kind of almost anti-literature as well. Even though it has literary references within it, and often brings them up in a kind of mocking way, but also with a critical eye, it's structurally almost impotent in a lot of regards. But sticking with the first part, because we've got part one, the underground, and part two, apropos of snow or of wet snow. And that actually has a slight narration going on within it. And I suppose here I can also keep on that line of thinking that it is so anti what it is expressing that the story, or what you could conceive of as a story, is told in the second part, whereas the first part is more of a criticism of everything and of a kind of psychological insight into this very disturbed, sick man, as the opening line goes, and a very wicked man. But there's no real story going on there. He's mainly just using it as a way of criticizing the ideology that I've previously mentioned. Whereas in the second part, we get a slight story, and the story is a kind of a result of that. But again, to say it's contradictory, or at least structurally anti its own form, we would normally get that story at the beginning, and then the kind of inner monologue diatribe at the end. Where Dostoevsky was like, fuck that. We're gonna start with the diatribe and then go into the story, which is actually 20 or so years previous to what we read at the beginning. And also, we end basically at the beginning because of that. And that isn't really a spoiler in a sense. Like, again, the plot isn't necessarily that important. To stick with the second part, although we do, again, have a narration going on here, there is a complete parody as well. There was a theme going on in literature at that time, which was very popular, of the redeemed prostitute. And Dostoevsky actually used that convention and spun it again on its head during that part of the story as a way of criticizing that whole idea as well. Basically saying, because this Lisa, who is a prostitute in the story, that's told in the kind of latter part of the second section, she kind of goes in, well, the narrator actually assumes, but we get the idea that she's joined this kind of cat house in this idea that she could actually go up the ranks eventually and be socially accepted because of it. And as naive as that thought is, our nameless narrator basically rips into her and says, you're relying on a society that doesn't exist helping you achieve this goal, when really it's going to eat you alive. And by the time you've been here a year, you would have aged 10, and at some point they'll just look at you like a piece of vermin and chuck you out onto the street, and then the next young girl's going to come along and they're going to scoop her up instead. They don't give a shit about you. And he basically does this in a way to be cruel, to be kind, but also because he wants her, ironically, to be enlightened to the disillusionment of enlightenment, which was Dostoevsky's complete point, which is basically the contradiction is layered over the contradiction. So to swing back to the opening section, we just meet this character who is mental, I would say. He is absolutely 100% fucking shitbat, lunatic, what the fuck crazy. And I related to him pretty much word for word. That's the hard part of this novel, overall, is this utter delirious cunt is totally relatable, whether you want him to be or not. His overlapping of his own ideas, his self-criticisms, his self-effacement, his whole outlook on society, everything about it. Like, he criticizes the idea of becoming anything, because to become anything is a fool's errand. Only people who are idiots basically get to thrive in this kind of society, and that anyone who has any inkling of intelligence will realize that the whole thing is a complete and utter farce, essentially. And I related to that especially. I mean, I related to all of it, really, overall, because we get to see the action that actually put our narrator underground in the second part. I was disturbed to recognize myself in him, really. That was what really kind of got under my skin, especially. It wasn't what he was saying or what he was criticizing or how he was behaving. It was because, yeah, I've been there. I was a bit like, oh, fuck. And actually, in a kind of reversal of outlook, I found that to be so comforting despite how vile the content is. Mainly because it made me realize that I'm a human being. And that is what Dostoevsky's kind of main point is. Although he is giving this kind of criticism against socialist utopianism, he's also demonstrating what the psychological impact of being human really is, and he's demonstrating that very, very, very well, leaving no unwanted stone unturned, and viewing it, of course, from a viewpoint that is underground and is a place. I like to think of that as a recess of the human psyche, which can be portrayed symbolically in this manner as a place literally in the world that people don't want to look at. So it has a kind of symbolism there within itself. Taken from the Russian translation, however, a few people have noted that notes from underground is actually incorrect. Whereas really, if we were to be entirely accurate, we would say notes from under the floorboards or something of that nature, more in that realm, which actually means more in the Russian translation because it means a place of vermin, of something that is undesirable, living literally under the floorboards of where you live. But I actually think that does work in English, because the whole idea of a subterranean place where it is underground is still within that kind of. I still think it parallels well, and that if it was called Underneath the Floorboards or Notes from Under the Floorboards, or it just, I don't know, it doesn't have the same ring to it in my mind. But it is an interesting insight and something that I found quite fascinating. And also, just to clarify why I would say this is my favourite Dostoevsky novel, is mainly because it doesn't have any of the Jesus shit in it. And that isn't because Dostoevsky didn't want it in there. There was a letter of complaint that was found that he wrote to his brother saying, "You've taken out one of the fucking chapters, dude." I think chapter 10, maybe the first section, maybe the second, I'm not quite sure. But he basically says that's where everything's justified, and that is where your faith in humanity, in religious thinking, or in Christ, which he was a big proponent of, although I don't think he was too preachy about it. He literally displayed it within his literature a lot of the time. He complained that that was taken out. But really, it is definitely to the behoovement of the novel, without a doubt. Because if that was suddenly put in there, then all of the contradictory, paradoxical musings that our narrator has would kind of be belittled, I would think. And I really honestly think it would be a detriment to the novel if that was kept in. Not that I necessarily think it should be taken out of his later novels, such as Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov. Not at all. But those novels expanded in such a way that he could explore those themes, and he had characters that I think gave a reasonable voice to it. Especially so in Crime and Punishment. I actually think Notes from Underground relates to Crime and Punishment, especially. You do get hints, especially through the delirious thinking of our unnamed narrator within Raskolnikov. And of course, we get the redeemed prostitute towards the end. Sonia, if I'm remembering correctly, is her name. I might be wrong on that. But she finds solace and redemption through the idea of Christ and of faith and things of that nature. And she wants Raskolnikov at the end of Crime and Punishment to take that, to heed and to pay attention to it. Whereas I don't think there's any room for it here, mainly because our unnamed narrator is actually so critical of the ideologies of his time, which again do not really include religious doctrine. They actually are more philosophical and, in some instances, scientifically based, where the narrator can recognize the benefit of those movements. But again, because he is in the 60s of the 19th century and 40 years old, whereas he depicts an era in the second part which was much more about romanticism and of a kind of delusional ideology that he is later very critical of, but he is also he's a result of it, as a kind of victim of circumstance, which we all kind of are. He basically came from that era, and then he's having to face another era where everything's changing so much. The rise of nihilism is certainly there as well. And he's mainly very contradictory because of those reasons. It's almost like he's been lied to by his own upbringing and his penal servitude, as he calls it later on in the novel, of his childhood, of growing up, of being of that era, and then having to live through this kind of revolution that was going on. And also how he is depicting the major flaws of it, of this kind of, I would say, almost teenage viewpoint where everyone can get along as long as they kind of follow these guidelines, which do not have any respect for the human psyche as a whole. It's often stated, I believe, that humanity would reject any utopian society just for the sake of rejecting it and for being vile and wicked for the sake of wickedness itself. Schopenhauer said similar, or had similar sentiments, and also the narrator in this piece during the second part actually often questions whether suffering itself is actually more beneficial to humanity than happiness or contentment ever could be. and therefore the striving for something such as frivolous as happiness, or bereft of action, essentially, is not something that we should really try to look up to, essentially. And because he insults the sex worker within the piece, he actually questions whether his cruelty might be something that could actually get her out of the situation that she's in, rather than trying to comfort her or trying to make reason. He's actually seeing it as potentially it might be the reason it saves her rather than actually ruins her. So again, the whole ideas that are expressed by this ideology of its time, he basically contradicts them via his own contradictions, essentially. But finally, I suppose, the other thing about this novel is just how fucking funny it is. It's hard to get that the first read around because you're kind of just trying to get into the psychological makeup of the character. But in the second section, you're just meeting this absolute fucking lunatic, and he's brilliant to read, mainly because he is so ridiculous. He mentions something about how, just firstly to begin, at the beginning, because he is making literary references, you get the idea that through reading he was put underground, and by writing this piece he is kind of trying to tunnel his way out of it. So again, there is another kind of comment on literature itself there going on. But to get back to the humour of the piece, which is abundant, I thought, he talks about having his little debaucheries, as he describes them. These are kind of moments in the narrator's life where he feels compelled to go out into society again, just to kind of amuse himself and to be around other people. He's also, kind of deliberately not mentioning how he needs that as a human being, but through the action, his, whole point is kind of expressed through action, kind of thing, rather than him actually saying it. Regardless, he mentioned something about being disrespected by somebody and how they kind of just ignore, they shove him to the side, and because he's a big man, whereas this unnamed narrator is quite a small, thin, weaselly man. And he ruminates on this one little incident for like 2 years. And he comes up with this really elaborate plan to get his revenge and to get his honor back and all this stuff. And his main fucking plan is just to bump shoulders with the guy, which with an equal measure. So he pushes him with the same trajectory or pressure or whatever you want to call it as his nemesis. So they're on equal footing from their point from that point onwards, sorry. And he goes on about this for so long, and it's so preposterous in its intensity that it's just hilarious, and there is a real black kind of comedy going on through it. And then he meets up with a bunch of schoolmates later on, kind of invites himself to go along to it as well. It's one of his only acquaintances he knows, Simonov, I think his name was. They were old school pals of his. Or pals, I use the word very loosely there. They kind of despise him. You can tell that straight away. Because of his rejection of society and life, and of everything that is going on at the period, he is a true outcast, and he looks like one as well. It isn't like he just rejects society. He kind of rejects everything that's going on. They're all kind of getting on with their lives and doing the things that are expected of them, whereas he's just like constantly got a finger up to everything. They don't really want him around. There's a great scene that goes on there when they're just drinking and he makes an absolute arse of himself, trying to be funny, trying to completely always show his intelligent side. He's very self-conscious of his appearance, but he also wants to appear intelligent more than attractive, and all of these things as he goes along a lot of the time, even overlapping his own thoughts, contradicting them within the same sentence sometimes, let alone paragraphs. And also just, he's hilarious. His speech to the prostitute later on in the story is hilarious in its harshness, but also there is an element of truth to it as well. and he projects this idea of a hero that he could be, but as soon as he recognizes himself of being that particular person or of being seen in that particular light, and this is true of many, many different traits of his character, he completely wants to contradict it and shun it straight away, just through fear of being seen in that manner, because he knows it to not be entirely true. So his seeking of an absolute truth is essentially causing his complete inertia, and it basically renders him paralyzed a lot of the time. And yeah, that's Notes from Underground. It's brilliant. It's considering how long ago it was written as well. I mean, it's kind of crazy. You can tell that it's completely ahead of its time as well. It doesn't pander to its audience. It doesn't give a shit about its audience, really. Even at the end, right at the kind of end, he's supporting the way he lives, essentially, even though he kind of is a complete recluse and he doesn't even come out from his kind of underground cave a lot of the time. He feels as if he's lived more than his fellow man, and he's dared to look into the elements of society and of us as individuals and see its ugly, dirty recesses and its contradictions and its vileness a lot of the time. And that's just what makes it so fucking fantastic. It's a brilliant read. I mean, there are other elements to it that I'm sure I've missed out here, but yeah, everything about it it's great. I love it as a reactionary piece as well, something that is a total, well, have you considered this kind of thing, and also just how angry and vile it is. I mean, the whole anti-book notion as well is supported by what the content and the structure of it is like. It's almost as if it doesn't want to be read in some regard. And the way it kind of has this stream of consciousness going on where each thought is written, which he actually declares that he's going to do at the beginning of the piece, regardless of what he thinks of it when he looks back on it, is it's brilliant. I thoroughly recommend it, and I think it's worthy of multiple reads throughout your lifetime. So yeah, I mean, this is Dostoevsky. You can't really go wrong. So yeah, get on it. I've been GC Mackay. Thank you very much for watching this, and I'll see you soon. Bye.